Hello and welcome to a Firstpost PoV. Things are escalating fast between Donald Trump and India. After announcing 25% tariff on all Indian exports, Trump has now added a Russia angle to the whole equation. He wants India to stop buying Russian oil. Russia, as you rightly know, is the top supplier of crude oil to India since the war in Ukraine began, and Trump wants us to stop buying oil from Russia. After 6 months of negotiation, why has he added this Moscow angle right now? We'll also take a step back and look at what the tariffs that Trump is imposing on the world means for the global economy and global trade. To try and answer some of these questions, let me introduce my guest, Mr. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who is the American Action Forum president and is also a former economic advisor to President Bush. Thank you so much, Mr. Douglas, for speaking to us. Now, when these tariffs were first announced, the initial plan was supposed to be shock and awe. You announce extremely high tariffs and you shock the countries of the world to come to the table and strike deals with you. And he has had some success with that. He's had deals with the Philippines, with Indonesia, with Japan and the European Union. Would you count those as successes, or would you say those are probably temporary trading arrangements that won't last?
I don't think you should think of these as traditional trade deals, which are negotiated out in great detail and which ultimately are ratified by the U.S. Senate but have the force of law. These are handshake agreements between the president and leaders in other countries, and they don't have the lasting quality of a genuine trade agreement. A good example of this is when he was first president in 2018, he reached an agreement with China, which said that China would buy $600 billion worth of U.S. agricultural products, and that never transpired. Those purchases didn't take place. There's no way to enforce violations of these agreements. There's no resolution of disputes. And so this is, a quote negotiating, but most of it turned out to be sending letters to people declaring the level of tariffs, not real negotiations in my view. And the three largest trading partners for the U.S., Canada, Mexico, and China, still have not reached agreement. So it's hard to call this a success.
You mentioned Canada there, and Canada is one of the few countries that has retaliated. But if you look at other US allies like the European Union or Japan, they have chosen to strike a deal and approach Trump in a conciliatory manner. What explains this difference in approach between American allies like Canada on the one hand and the European Union and the Japanese on the other?
I think the real issue is the cross use of national security considerations. So with Europe, they brought into the trade negotiations NATO defense spending and also some health policy, how much Europe pays for pharmaceuticals. And rather than get into that larger set of issues, they settled. Same's true in Japan. Canada didn't have that. Canada is a straight economic negotiation. And the president, for whatever reason, has a particular dislike of Canadian policies and really has gone after them much more vigorously than other countries.
Would you say what worked for the Americans and for Trump in this case was the disunity? He imposed tariffs on dozens of countries, but all of them did not gang together to combat these tariffs. Everybody had their own interests, and so they pursue their own negotiations with Trump. Do you think the world missed a chance to perhaps gang up and use that combined negotiating power against Donald Trump?
Perhaps, but I think if you step back, what the administration wants you to believe is that this has been an enormous success because the process was successful. He picked off countries one by one, got them to agree to his tariffs without the U.S. giving up anything. But if you look at the policy, what happens is we go from an effective tariff rate of under 2% to one that's nearly 20%. And those are tariffs paid by U.S. businesses and U.S. households. And they're going to have a demonstrably negative effect on the U.S. economy. If they stay in place, the world will have plenty of time to reshape its trade patterns. There will be different trading alliances and different trade flows, and the U.S. will lose out as a result. So I think while it may not be the case that the global economy quickly took on the president's tariffs, over time, it's inevitable that it will. And in the end, the U.S. will be left out.
And what's the sentiment in your country right now? I think all the experts are in agreement that tariffs are generally bad for the economy. They tend to drag down global trade and global growth. But what about the people in America? There appears to be a split because the real effect of those tariffs is not being felt right now, is it?
I think that's correct, but that pain is starting to show up. So even as we speak, we have just received a new employment report in the U.S., and it turns out that employment growth outside of the health sector has been negative for the past 3 months. Unemployment is starting to creep up. Inflation is starting to creep up. This president was elected to deliver better economic results, not higher unemployment and higher inflation. So I think they're going to have to think hard about whether they're going to stay on this trajectory and be successful.
Now, one thing we have heard in this discussion is a so-called Mar-a-Lago plan. I don't know if you've heard about this, which basically says that Trump and his allies want to artificially reduce the value of the dollar so as to make American manufacturing more competitive in the world. Is there any credibility to these claims or this theory, or is it just one of those things that floats around in the Trump presidency?
I think it's closer to the latter. The model for this is the so-called Plaza Accord back in the 80s, which engineered a cheaper dollar. The dollar has been relatively strong, but the policies of this administration have already weakened it somewhat, down 11% in a relatively short time. The Federal Reserve will end up with lower interest rates because the economy is weakening dramatically. That will also tend to put downward pressure on the dollar. And I think that will take all of the steam out of these so-called Mar-a-Lago Accord discussions.
We mentioned some of the deals that Trump has struck. They also involve a promise of investment, like the Japanese and the Europeans have promised to invest dozens and in some cases hundreds of billion dollars in the US economy. Do you feel those investments are going to materialize? And if so, what sort of timeline are we looking for before that money starts to come in?
So I think the ones we saw from the EU are simply unrealistic. If you look at the scale of energy purchases right now, about 70 billion a year, supposedly going to 250 billion, it's hard to imagine that actually happens. And as I said, what will the administration do if the European Union doesn't buy $250 billion? There's no enforcement mechanism here. If you look at the Japan agreement, where there was more detail, this is essentially existing programs for loans and loan guarantees that the Japanese government will simply deploy for firms interested in being in the U.S. And so I think there's a lot of this that is not really new, but is being packaged up to be included in the deal. One of the things that's sort of ironic about all of this is that the president claims to have entered into these tariffs and negotiations to reduce the U.S. trade deficit. Big investment inflows will raise the trade deficit, not lower it. And so these work at cross purposes with the stated intent of the deals.
Let's talk about his dealings with India now. And a red line clearly for New Delhi is agriculture. Almost half of all Indians work in agriculture. It's a politically sensitive sector in India. And so the Indian government is rightfully pushing back, denying the US access to the agriculture market. But Trump seems to be insisting on it. Is this a case of Trump not being aware of the political and the cultural sensitivities around agriculture? Or is this a case of him just not caring what the context is?
I think he is relatively uncaring about the sensitivities in India about the ag sector. I think he uses it for a U.S. domestic audience to say, see, they really are the bad guys here. It's not us. It's they're the ones who are not playing fair in trade, and thus justify his tariffs. So he's fond of going country by country, finding a single thing. In Canada, it's dairy products and softwood lumber. In India, it's the ag sector. Pointing to that and saying, see, they don't play fair. We can do what we want.
So then how do you see these talks progress? Because we know a couple of visits were scheduled in August. A US team was supposed to come to India, and an Indian negotiating team was also supposed to go to Washington. But reports are saying that both those trips have been cancelled. Do you think there is hope for reviving this trade process, or do you think it's a non-starter right now?
I think the key question is whether it will remain in the scope of an economic policy negotiation, in which case I think the talks, which were very successful early on, could be revived. But the president has broadened it out to include purchases of Russian oil, purchases of military equipment from Russia, and bringing in foreign policy considerations. It's hard to see that helping things. Putting on the table more issues that are complicated is not the recipe for getting a quick agreement.
You're right, that Russian angle is certainly not helping in India. It's worried a lot of people, including policymakers in New Delhi. But I'm wondering what you made of the overall strategy that India took. Right at the outset, we ruled out in retaliation. We said we want to take this in a conciliatory approach and strike a trade deal. We did not prepare any countermeasures like the Europeans or the Canadians or the Chinese. Was that a mistake in hindsight? Do you think India should have kept all its options on the table?
I thought it was just a very sensible strategy. India is a very important country in the future of global economics, and to appeal to the better instincts of the United States, I thought was exactly the right thing to do. This president didn't take that mantle quickly and didn't seal a deal. I think that will be a missed opportunity in retrospect. I think when people look back from the vantage point of 5 years from now, he will be out of office. These tariffs will have largely been rolled back, and we will have missed a chance to solidify a relationship with a very important part of the global economy.
Look at all of these recent deals that President Trump has struck, whether it's with the Philippines or the US or the Japanese or the Europeans. These countries are financially and in some cases militarily dependent on the United States, which is partly why he's been able to strike them so easily. But you look at the Indians or the Chinese, they're playing hardball. Has these recent deals emboldened the Trump team to think that they will have more success with the Indians? Or is there an understanding that these are completely different negotiations and it's not going to be a cakewalk?
I think there's an understanding that China and India are different. I mean, they're harder. The negotiations are tougher. They're better negotiators than those countries have been. As I said, for the ones that matter the most, you go India, China, Canada, Mexico, we haven't got to yes, and those are the most important negotiations. So the notion that somehow this has been a uniformly successful strategy, I think, is hard to support.
Also, tell us where this whole idea of tariffs came from in the first place. I mean, for years, we've been told that the United States is propping up and it's the leading proponent of free trade. And suddenly, all we're hearing from Washington is tariffs and protectionism. Where did this idea that tariffs can fix the deficit and fix the economy come from? Is this Trump, or is this the people around him who are saying this?
It's him. For 40 years in public life, Donald Trump has promoted tariffs as something that the U.S. needs and should use to guarantee not just fair trade, but prosperity in the United States. Many of the things he says, other countries will pay the tariffs. They're going to bring back manufacturing. They're going to restore the U.S. golden age of steel, are demonstrably wrong. But that hasn't stopped him one bit. And so this begins with him. There are people in his circle, in the economic officials of this administration who think this is not a good idea. But when the president says we do this, they do it.
Do you think this is something a future Republican president will also stick to, or is this just a Trumpian thing?
I think it's a Trumpian thing, but I will say I have the following concern. These are tariffs at a level we haven't seen in 100 years. And what I think we saw in the 20th century was very high tariffs post-World War II, and then about a 60-year process, the GATT rounds, the WTO, where the world lowered those tariffs, reduced barriers to trade, unified the global economy. It took decades to unwind the bad policy of a few years in the 30s and 40s. This is bad policy. It will be unwound. The question is how fast.
Finally, let me just ask you, when this trade war drags on and escalates, as we've seen in the last couple of days, what do you see as the worst case scenario, both for the United States and its economy and for the rest of the world?
I think the worst case scenario is simple. We see the United States go into a recession, and there's a big backlash. They take down some of the tariffs. Meanwhile, no progress has been made with India, China, Canada, Mexico on cementing those important trade relationships going forward. And the rest of the globe, the Indonesias and South Koreas, start looking around for other trading partners because the U.S. is no longer a reliable trading partner. That's the worst case outcome in my view.
Well, we would certainly hope it doesn't come to that, because the world is just coming out of a really tough period with pandemics and wars all around. Last thing we want is an escalating and extended trade war with the United States at its center. We'll keep a track on what's happening on the trade front, but thank you so much, Mr. Douglas, for speaking to Firstpost.
Firstpost now available in 9 languages on YouTube. English,
Stands at $36 trillion.
French,
Le FMI, comme
German,
Geschäftsführenden Direktor,
Hindi,
$30 trillion ka karj mo.
Indonesian,
Pemerintah tanpa pemeriksaan.
Italian,
Kali radikali.
Japanese,
4 兆ドル以上も
Portuguese,
por causa do próprio balanço patrimonial.
Spanish.
Beautiful bill.
Go to Settings, click on Audio Track and select a language of your choice. Be the first to know what's happening around you in your first language. Firstpost.